friends, welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture on 1 Timothy and Titus. You may remember that in an earlier lecture we already talked about 2 Timothy, but at least in the introductory portion of this lecture, it may be helpful to think about 2 Timothy as well. I want to start the lecture with this notion of these three letters, again, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. These have typically been designated as the Pastoral Epistles since the 18th century. They are, as I've mentioned in another lecture, some of the most seriously doubted letters of Paul in the last 200 years. That is to say, in the last 200 years, more scholars have begun to question whether or not they were written by Paul or whether they were written even in the lifetime of Paul. And so there are some scholarly tendencies that I think are at least worthy of our attention, even if we don't agree with them or come to the same conclusions. The first is that there is an authentic Paul that can be discovered, and this authentic Paul is equivalent with genuine Christianity. The second thing that often is assumed is that if we can, is this connection between authorship and authority. So if we say that Paul did not write these three letters, then they somehow have less authority than the other letters of Paul. And then the third scholarly tendency is to treat all three of these letters as basically a group, as if they were all written at the same time by the same person with the same issues or problems in mind. So again, these are the sort of assumptions that lie behind a lot of the practices and theories related to the pastoral epistles. And I want us to hold them and question them, I think, as a means of moving forward. So why has this happened? Why have people singled out these three letters as potentially inauthentic or disputed letters of Paul? Well, the first thing is it's difficult to place them in Paul's career based on the other letters and from Acts. There's not a clear place for them in that career. There are also issues related to the style of writing. Scholars will suggest that the vocabulary and the sentence structure is different in these three letters than the other letters of Paul. It seems some scholars suggest that the nature of opponents imagined in each of these letters is different. It's also assumed that the church organization imagined by all three letters is more organized and hierarchical than what we see in other letters of Paul. And the idea is that this deeper organization and more established hierarchy would only come later after Paul's death. And then I think probably one of the driving concerns is that there's an understanding that the theology of these letters is different from that of Paul. There are some common words and phrases and ideas missing from these letters. There's perhaps a more exalted understanding of Jesus' divine identity. And of course, there are some hard teachings about women. So those are the issues with the pastorals. And these issues are so pronounced and so well recognized that a number of study Bibles and one-volume commentaries and other academic resources would just take it at face value that these are non-Pauline letters. I don't think that this lecture is going to solve the debate, and it may not resolve the debate in your mind either. But I want to revisit some questionable assumptions that I think open us up to new ways of engaging these letters. And the first is that we often assume that Acts and Paul's letters give us all that he could have said or all that we could know about Paul's ministry and mission. And the fact is that's not the case. We have occasional letters, and we don't have all of them. And we don't have access through the letters to the mind of Paul. We have limited access and resources. I think the second assumption sort of builds on that first one, in that there is this unity or coherence to Paul's thinking in the other letters of Paul. So again, there's this idea that there's these 3 disputed letters and then the other 10 letters are all coherent. But that again is not the case. As I've pointed out in other lectures, we see a great diversity in the letters of Paul. The third assumption is that the pastoral letters were all written together and they therefore all fall together. Again, the idea is that they're basically all the same, and what I would invite you to consider as you read 1 Timothy and Titus is to notice the ways that they are not the same, the ways that they're different, and then put that into conversation with your earlier reading of 2 Timothy. Because the fourth assumption then is that there's no variety in these letters, these 3 pastoral letters, and there is. I think that we'll see that as we read them comparatively. And then finally, the assumption is that they're sort of, they don't respond to the context or to the recipient. They're fake letters, in other words, unlike Paul's more responsive letters. And again, I want you to read paying attention to the ways in which these letters are responsive. Okay, that was a big introduction to a debated and important biblical concept or a scholarly debate. I want to turn now to 1 Timothy and provide a brief outline. The first thing to note is that it opens with a salutation and then some instructions about correcting deviance in 1:3 through 20. And then 2:1 through 6:19 is a large section that in its own ways all deals with respectable behavior in the household of God. So there are some instructions about worship. There are words about the responsibilities of church leaders, a description of the household of God, some words about godly training and a godly example. Then a section that scholars describe as the household codes that addresses people of different ages, genders, and roles in a family. And then a final word about correct or sound teaching. And then in 6:20 through 21, a closing. So it's a robust letter that is really concerned with what does life look like in the household of God, which is not just a human household, but refers to the larger church community as well. Next, a brief outline of Titus. Titus is shorter than 1 Timothy. It again opens with a salutation, and then there is a distinct section providing instruction about leaders, first elders, then bishops, and then a warning about rebellious people. Then in chapter 2, again, we get some language about behavior in the church. There's instructions for older women and older men, for younger women and younger men, for slaves, and then a general word about being trained by the grace of God. And then in 3:1 through 11, there are deeper or more extended instructions for outsiders, and then a closing in 3:12 through 16. So as you read these 2 letters, and maybe you'll read 2 Timothy again just for fun and being an overachiever, but as you read, I want you to keep in mind a couple of things. The first is keep in mind the degree to which these letters seem different to you than the other letters of Paul that you've read. What are commonalities and what are differences? The second is, how are these letters related to one another? Do you see them as really similar or are they different? And then the third would be, how do you see 1 Timothy and Titus providing instructions for the community? And how might those instructions continue to be relevant for us today? And how might they be irrelevant or unhelpful today? All right, that's all I plan to say about the Pastoral Epistles in this lecture. I hope that the lecture was clear and will get you at least asking some questions about these writings, and I can't wait to hear what you see. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.